The pandemic has left millions of people around the country out of work, but it also comes after decades of growing economic inequality. One response to this is an exploration of steps toward a guaranteed minimum income. You can find that in a recent report by the Boston Foundation's Boston Indicators program in partnership with the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center and the Economic Security Project. To explain the report is one of the co-authors from Boston Indicators, Trevor Mattos. Thank you very much for being with us, Trevor.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Trevor, start with what has happened before the pandemic over the past few decades here, because we see this graph showing a widening gap of economic inequality. Tell us how bad that has been getting.
That's a great question and a great starting place. I think that is really what led us to start looking into the minimum guaranteed income to begin with, was just that, a lot of people that are here in this sort of Boston-centric world see all the booming development, the really successful knowledge-intensive industries that we have, whether it be Kendall Square or the Seaport District or just in downtown. And we have this idea that things are going good for everybody, and, we've got a trickle down system and all, the rising tide is lifting all boats. But the reality is very different from that. What people are actually experiencing on the ground, at the neighborhood level, here in Boston and throughout the Commonwealth is just so very different. We are sort of struggling with both an incredibly high cost of living here in Massachusetts in particular, and as you referred to, just this yawning gap between, the highest earners, the wealth owning sort of group of individuals here throughout the region, and those that are working for a living, just trying to make ends meet, raising families, struggling with the cost of housing, the cost of childcare. It's really just a problem that's been a long while in the making, and policymakers have just failed to take definitive action. And that was all pre-pandemic. So, that just gives you a hint at where we are now.
Well, even pre-pandemic, I would say people of all races were probably locked into the stagnation, at least for the most part. But within those figures, there's also a racial gap. What did you see there?
Absolutely. And this may not come as a shock to folks that are paying attention, that are interested in advancing justice for our neighbors and our friends and for, our communities. The reality is that, incomes and wages at the median or at, a little bit lower down the income distribution have been stagnant more or less across the board, but there is a different story. And when we start to pull apart the threads and look more closely, we see that, white workers and communities have been able to benefit from at least some modest wage gains over the past several decades. And during that same time frame, in particular, Black and Latinx workers and communities have just really, been concentrated in occupations and industries and sectors that are not providing a living wage that people can, really provide for themselves and their families.
Well, your basic idea here is more income supports for people who I think for the most part are people with jobs. But on the other hand, now we're talking about people faced with crises because of the pandemic. This isn't about stagnation anymore. How does that change what you're proposing?
Yeah, we are living in sort of multiple crises. We're living through these layered, interlocking crises all at the same time: the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the racial disparities, and, frankly, the racist institutional problems that have been longstanding and remain in place. And these things have just served to make the situation ever more dire, both for low-income working families and as well for those that, in this current crisis with the record job losses, no longer have earned income. And so, they're relying on sort of the patchwork of programs that we have either here at the state level or, the response coming from the feds, which up until recently had been fairly robust and, really did make a difference, certainly with the expanded unemployment benefits that the federal government had been supplying, in addition to the stimulus checks, which of course was helpful, but it was just one time. So for most people, that wouldn't even cover rent. So, where that leaves us is just that there's a lack of clarity at the federal level with precisely what is going to happen with, unemployment assistance and any other supports and how long that'll go on for. And so people are a little bit just left hanging in the balance here, in the lurch, and trying to figure out ways to create economic security and stability.
Well, at the heart of your idea is a proposal to expand the earned income tax credit, along with the states add into that, and maybe expand the number of people who would be eligible for that. It's not a huge amount of money they would be getting, so why would it be so important for them to get this kind of help?
It's a fair point. I think we envision this idea as being bold and being ambitious, but not a silver bullet by any means. This is a valid and viable starting point to start to build much more stability for these folks that are really struggling now more than ever. And the reason that we chose to look at the earned income tax credit is because it's an existing structure that has been fairly successful for quite some time at providing, just a fairly substantial amount of assistance, although it varies depending on, what the situation of the family or individual might be. And so there's sort of this existing infrastructure architecture that you could then leverage and build upon and start taking, whether you want to think of them as baby steps or at least some concrete movement in the direction of what I would call, I suppose, more of a minimum guaranteed income here in the Commonwealth.
Of course, one of the other things that people have been debating about for years is how do you provide help to people without disincentivizing work? How does that apply here?
Yeah, another really helpful clarifying question, because this is something we wrestled with as we were working with our partners, which, at Boston Indicators, we focus a lot on various economic issues, but this partnership that we had with the Mass Budget and Policy Center, with the Economic Security Project, really helped fine tune the analysis and our ability to hone in on, a really clear direction. And we really struggled with how do we make this as progressive as possible in terms of doing the most for the people that need the assistance the most. And yet at the same time, as you alluded to, without trying to pull out this feature of the earned income tax credit, which does encourage people to work more. That is, they get more from the EITC as their earnings increase. And the way that we chose to sort of balance those two things was to establish, as you know, a minimum guaranteed income. That includes folks that don't have any earned income at all, which we felt was particularly appropriate with the level of job losses that we've seen as of late. But at the same time, we did not completely remove this relationship where as income, goes from extremely low to sort of more moderate, folks will get more, even from this reformed earned income tax credit. So it balances both pieces. You have a minimum credit, but you also are allowing people to sort of seek more hours, seek a higher hourly rate, and thus benefit, from this proposal as well.
Well, to reduce the tax burden or increase the negative tax on this population, you're going to have to increase taxes in other ways. What could that mean?
Yeah, and we started this project before the pandemic, and it was going to be a tough question to answer even then. So now more than ever, that is the question people are asking is, how the heck are you going to afford this program? Which, by the way, a couple top line numbers might be helpful for context. In this proposal, it's a 5-point overhaul to the state earned income tax credit. The cost would be roughly $1.3 billion, which is significant. But it would also lead to a doubling of the number of Massachusetts residents who receive the EITC, and it would double the amount, the average credit that recipients do get here in Massachusetts. And one way to just think about the numbers is, we live in an extremely wealthy state. If you put it into sort of the global context, Massachusetts would in fact be the 5th wealthiest country in the world based on GDP per capita. And beyond that, in terms of just the size of the economy, Massachusetts GDP is roughly 600 billion per year. The state budget is, somewhere upwards of 40 billion a year. And one really helpful sort of comparison point that we identified was that the state actually provides special business tax breaks on an annual basis to industry, to mutual funds companies, to the film industry in terms of the film tax credit. Those add up to over $1 billion per year. So it's really a question of will, and it's a question of what we want to prioritize. And in a moment where so many people are just teetering on the brink of, dire economic insecurity, this is a choice that I think Massachusetts, notwithstanding the crises that we are confronting, is fairly well positioned to head that direction.
Well, I know your report has more details, including some information about how these ideas have been tried out in other states. So if people want to plunge into that, what's the best way for them to find that online?
Sure. So bostonindicators.org, that's our organization's website, and you'll see the report right there at the very top. It's called A Guaranteed Income for Massachusetts.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Trevor Mattos from Boston Indicators.